All right. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the show happening on Thursday here, either in YouTube, Red Hat Developer Channel, and OpenShift TV. Today is gonna be a different format from usual. Usually, we have Sebi that is doing great interview, great demos. Today, to compare Sebi, we have three of us, and we have a super special guest that I'd like to introduce you immediately, which is Daniel Bryant. Daniel Bryant is joining us today for an interview. The topic is going to be DevOps All The Things. But before going to Daniel, I will also like to introduce our other host, which would be Anna Maria and Sebi. And Alex, sorry. Sebi always in my mind. I don't know why.
Oh, hello, everybody. Happy to see you and to welcome you here.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for joining, because today it's going to be a special day because we've got Daniel in one side, and also it's a different format. So I think that it's going to be really a different way of how we used to do the show.
Yeah, and Daniel, you know how we say in Italian, dulcis in fundo. So the best at the end. Please, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Natale. Appreciate it. Yeah, so Daniel Bryant, Director of DevRel at Ambassador Labs at the moment. Background is a lot of Java development. I'm a Java champion, been coding Java longer than I care to remember, probably like literally from when it was created, to say it. Like I sort of was doing my university education around 2000, so Java was super popular then. Lots of Java development when I left university, and still love Java now. I don't code as much as I'd like these days, but my interests lie with the ops space, particularly helping a lot of Java developers embrace things like Kubernetes and Docker and cloud, because it's like a big jump, right? Moving from, say, coding Java, which you all know and love, to suddenly all these different layers. Like I sort of say it's turtles all the way down, right? You got Kubernetes, Docker, VMs, bare metal, like these kind of things, right? So I really enjoy helping map the old world to the new world for folks.
That's amazing.
Daniel, do you remember when you need to add the swing.jar in the class path to have these UI applications? I remember that. So
100%. I remember when Java 2 came out, it was a big deal, right? Like now what, with Java 17, right? And I was like, Java 2 was like revolutionary. I was actually on my intern placement at the time working for the UK government. And it was Java 1.4 and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, I've literally been there, Alex. So you and I have been there from the start, right?
Yeah.
Right, I was looking at the chat. I was writing that if you have any question at any time, please send out in the chat. We're streaming both in YouTube channel, Red Hat Developer YouTube channel, and OpenShift TV on Twitch. So after this quick introduction of who we are, let me introduce myself. My name is Natale Vinto. I'm a developer advocate for OpenShift here in Red Hat. And today's topic, I like today's topic because it's DevOps All The Things. So we were talking about develop, but today everyone is DevOps with Kubernetes. You anticipated a little bit, Daniel. Say we have the layer Kubernetes and Docker and virtual machine or infrastructure. So basically today, everyone is a DevOps potentially. What do you think about it?
It's a great question, Natale, and I'm a bit torn on this one, right? Because like part of me in my heart, like I've always been a generalizing specialist type person. Like I'm a lifelong learner. Do you know what I mean? I'm always keen to learn new things, and I'm happy to stretch these things. And for me, when I sort of bumped into Chef and Puppet and things like that, and then naturally Amazon and learning about Terraform, I was really keen to do that kind of thing. But then in my consulting, and now at Ambassador Labs, customers we have, some developers are like, I just want to write code. Right, and like looking back at things like Cloud Foundry and Heroku, right? They were like, I just did CF push, I just did Heroku push, and I didn't have to worry about Terraform, Docker, all these different things, right? I mean, like, not trying to be negative on all technologies because they're amazing, but I'm a little bit torn in like some of us want to be full stack, and I think it should be easy for us to do that. But I think some folks just want to write the code, and that's cool, right? Business ideas, writing code, delivering value to users. So I'd love to hear your thoughts actually, because it's like it's almost two personalities types I think of developers.
Right. So the dev and the ops now merged in this new figures, can be also DevSecOps. We have many words, dev something ops. Yeah, but this is very interesting, and I would like to also start with this. Probably Kubernetes is de facto standard today for running workloads, but it brings also some complexity. So it's not or at least from the beginning, was not very straightforward to start with Kubernetes. So the challenge probably today is how we can help developer in getting started with Kubernetes. And now Kubernetes can be better and better to bring more developer tools, framework that help deploying. So I would like to hear from you. What do you think about this evolution in the Kubernetes ecosystem for developers?
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because actually Kubernetes, depending on where you're coming from, can be a step up. Like if you're used to dealing with, say, VMs, or you've got no concept of kind of how things are running, actually doing kubectl apply, and you've only got to deal with pods, services, deployments, right? Say, these kind of things. It actually can be simpler. But if you're coming from a kind of PaaS-like world, and that maybe Heroku, Cloud Foundry, Beanstalk, there's many, right? Or even a custom PaaS internally. Like I know, OpenShift, right? There's a lot of folks use OpenShift. A lot of folks have built their own things around this kind of space as well. If you're coming from that as a developer, it's a step down to Kubernetes. Do you know what I mean? Because you're used to having all this fantastic tool chain built for you. You literally, maybe simple command builds a container, simple command pushes it like the code down your pipeline, and happy days. So I think it's really interesting. It depends on your perspective of where you're coming from, like as a developer, if that makes sense. Kubernetes can be a real enabler in terms of simplifying down a lot of quite complicated things, or it can be, that's your point, Natale, actually quite a big jump in complexity. As like a lot of developers have never had to think about operational stuff. And off the
Right.
gate, right? If you're writing a Docker file, suddenly you're bringing in an OS, right? Now, what do I bring in? Do I bring in Ubuntu, CentOS? Do I go full fat JDK, full fat JRE? All these kind of things, right? In the Java world, and suddenly, like even at the Docker file, there's a whole new world of complexity that's opened up. Let alone YAML for Kubernetes. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's the interesting dilemma, like that a lot of folks bump into.
Yeah, I think I had this conversation like 3.5 years ago with a colleague, because he was upset that he had to migrate from CF push to. And I remember that we had a challenging conversation around, why should I use Kubernetes? Tell me why.
It's a really good point, right? And like always,
Right.
we're all technologists here. We love our technology, but like I've got more and more in tune with the business as sort of my career's migrated, and I often find myself in saying like, what's the business value of doing that? Like, why are we doing that? And it's like, well, it's the latest thing. And do you know what I mean? And you have to honestly ask yourself that kind of question, right? Like, and I love my tech as much as the next person, but like migrating from Cloud Foundry to Kubernetes or something to Kubernetes, like it's not only like operationally complex to do so, you have to learn so many new things. And like as a developer, you're already learning the latest version of Java, the latest version of Spring, the latest version of Quarkus. Do you know what I mean? And suddenly it's like, hey, you got to learn some Kubernetes stuff now. That is a little bit like.
On the other side, probably we can say that this migration is bringing also some standard. So we have something standard to work with. Before it was, everything. Your workload, your Java apps could run on everywhere. Basically, you have to support multiple operating system, multiple platform. It was not trivial. Let's say moving from virtual machine to virtual machine was not that easy. Today, it's a container image, very easy to port everywhere. And then the platform is Kubernetes, which is bringing a standard. Everyone is using this standard. We are converging to this standard. So it should be easier to at the end to get to the point. But I think we're still in this, we are still progressing in that. We're still in this in this moment where we are progressing from monolith to microservices to the legacy VMs to Kubernetes. So yeah, that's why probably we are still saying it's not easy to start with, but I know there's lots of work in progress.
Yeah, and there's a really good point, Natale. There's lots of benefits as well. I do sometimes find myself being a bit negative, right? Like the realist in me is like, this Kubernetes thing's complicated, but I love it. Don't get me wrong. And there's a lot of benefits, right? Like Kubernetes just takes away a lot of headaches in terms of managing, applications and containers. And I 100% support what you're saying around standardization. And I think another thing that's worth mentioning is this is standardization done in the right way. Like coming from my Java days where I was on like some of the JCP stuff, love the people, love the process, or whatever, but some of the stuff was designed by committee, and it was like build the spec before the tech. Do you know what I mean? And that, like, I'm not going to pick on any names, it'd be unfair, right? But maybe like what was it? The Java was it Java? What was the complete brain freeze? The Java Beans EJB. The EJB spec, right, was a classic example. EJB1 was designed by committee, and then people sort of retrofitted the tech onto the spec. Whereas with Kubernetes, like the Kubernetes spec is pretty well standardized now, but there's a lot of other stuff being innovated, and when it's successful, then it's being standardized. Does that make sense? Like you look at I worked a lot in the ingress space with the Ambassador Edge Stack and things like that, and emissary ingress. And the ingress spec in Kubernetes has taken a long time to come to fruition, but that's because we realize it's really complicated. And there's like the common denominators are actually quite tricky to pull out. But I think the ultimate result of the spec is better that way, with all of the community chipping in their ideas, bringing in their practical experience, and then we end up on this standard at the end. That's a much better thing to do than try and design it up front. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And probably this leads also to frameworks like Spring Boot or Quarkus have also functionality to help developers getting started in Kubernetes, working with Kubernetes. Recently, Alex published a workshop we're doing, which is a Spring Boot for developers. Very cool. And there's some module talking about JIP or JCube. So you can control from Java also this complexity of creating a container, complexity of creating Kubernetes manifest. So let's say giving back power to developers, even on Kubernetes, with the benefit of this standard, this ecosystem, as you said. So probably, there's lots of work to do yet, but
Agreed.
They're great. They're great.
I think like where we're at now at that point in Natale, like it's pretty good. Like when I first bumped into Kubernetes, like was it 4 years ago, there was a lot of DIY, like everything you had to kind of build yourself, right? Now I'm a massive fan, like you mentioned, like Jib and a few things. I'm a massive fan of build packs, for example, coming from the CF space, right? The CNCF project, buildpacks.io, is just fantastic for like getting started, right? And it removes a bunch of complexity for me as a developer. I don't have to think about it anymore. Do you know what I mean? Rather than create my Docker file, I just do, pack and a few other commands, and it goes, oh, you're using a Java application, and here's how I should configure the Docker file. Here's how I should build my container. So, and the other tools you mentioned, like there's still a lot of work to do. I agree with you, but now is like a good time to get involved. If you're like a Java developer that hasn't moved into Kubernetes, like it's definitely worth looking around at what's available now. You can go old school, write your YAML, build your Docker file, or you can use all these cool new tools and maybe save yourself some headaches, right?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of tools that can help you generate and approximate better what should be there so that your application runs optimally with Kubernetes. There are so many helpers and cheat sheets, and it's not like back in the days when you used to like go into the shadiest places of the internet to find the right the right matching commands. And also the documentation has improved, because if you look at the documentation back in the days, in the earlier releases, it was a little bit more difficult to grasp on it, but now I think it's more developer friendly. And also, if you're looking at the tasks that are on kubernetes.io, they're very helpful in terms of comparing to real life. Like you do get into those situations. So yeah, I totally agree there.
Yeah, and even for let's say that the way how a developer can run a Kubernetes cluster locally. I mean, at the beginning we only have a Minikube, but now we've got Minikube, Kind, KES. There is a lot. Yeah, there is a lot of ways to run the Kubernetes locally. So yeah, I think that it's there is several open paths there in the Kubernetes system, and well, it's quite interesting. And regarding these improvements for Kubernetes, I think that there is one missing piece in Kubernetes. I don't know, Daniel, what you think, is about persistence. So putting a database inside Kubernetes. Then, yeah, things becomes quite painful. And I know a lot of companies that they are just moving to Kubernetes, but they have the the databases in virtual machines. So I think that there is a space here that it's in that maybe could be an improvement. I don't know how. I mean, because it's because it's really easy to say, yeah, this is this is not working correctly, or this is super hard. But that's the easy thing. The next thing is, okay, and how to improve, right?
Yeah. State is always hard, Alex, isn't it? I remember, like, again, when like Kubernetes first emerged on the scene, there were so many vendors talking about storage and networking. Those are the two big challenges, right? And even now, like, storage is super complicated. Like, just managing, like we all know, like even in the Java world, right, managing global state is really hard. When you're mutating state, really hard. So I always recommend to folks, if you can push out the responsibilities to manage state to your cloud vendor, or if you're running it on-prem, operate in a similar fashion, right? So run, I use Amazon quite a lot, use RDS, use Aurora, these kind of things, right? If you're running Kafka, use a managed service. I just think it's really complicated without Kubernetes managing state. As soon as you add that extra layer on, I do wonder, is Kubernetes the right place for this? A lot of vendors will say yes, but I just think, for me as a developer, Kubernetes is amazing for my stateless apps, or my apps that sort of light state management. But databases, like this, like data is like so critical to business, right? You don't want to lose it. You don't want to have like latency issues accessing it. And the cloud vendors have done such amazing work over the years. I trust them more than I do probably myself, right?
Yeah, there are solutions for database which are really popular. We can say they're really reliable. But this introduce another concept I would like to talk to you about. So, what do you think about those Kubernetes? We understood that there's this complexity of managing stateful apps on Kubernetes. No, there are some approach trying to solve it. For instance, one of these approaches, the let's say the operator framework. So bringing, because if you see how Facebook is doing stuff, or Google before, Facebook has its own tool called Tupperware. They don't use Kubernetes. They implemented their own stuff. So in one of the conference they do is the System Design Conference. Is a private conference that you can see what they tell, but you cannot attend unless you are Facebook or Google or any big of these running very big workloads. So what they say, hey, we have our system. And developers, when they build the app, they need to use our SDK, because in the SDK, they know where the app is going to go, in what they have the concept of sharding when deploying the application. So it's a thing, it's thought from the beginning for also stateful application. This is something missing in Kubernetes. Probably the operator could be an approach, because you are in the life cycle in Kubernetes. You have some callback, you react to events. Probably for what you say for stateful application, operators are a good approach for that. But I would like to hear from you. What do you think about this approach or any other approach for stateful application?
Yeah, it's a genuinely tricky one, Natale. And I think it does come down to the business's requirements and comfort with managing the tech. Because I think operators, like you say, it's basically the codification of a human operator working on a data store, right? So all the operations we would have taken back in the day on managing our data store, we can codify as part of that life cycle. So I really like the operator approach. I still think there's challenges with actually managing the state in the cluster. Do you know what I mean? I always look how many layers are involved. And Kubernetes, you have your volume claims and then the persistent volumes, and I think unless you buy into a sort of framework like Vitess, and there's a few things like that, right? Unless you buy into a framework that does sharding, say, like out of the box, like I think there's a temptation to start doing a lot of the stuff yourself. And I always get a bit nervous. And like I've built, hands up, right? I've built sharding stuff back in my Java days, like 20 years ago, when it was like MySQL, and we tried to do some sharding over like basic cloud stuff at the time. So I think operators give you that option, but I think you'd have to be a fairly big scale, to your point, like almost Google-like scale, right? Or a bank or something like that, where you're really going to get your return on investment there. I think for a lot of the smaller shops, I'd be tempted to punt and say, hey, just use your cloud providers, setup.
Right. Yeah, it's a kind of SaaS for that specific use case.
Exactly.
Database SaaS. Yeah, in this SaaSy way, probably better if some other SRE team manage this complexity
Perfectly
for
said.
you.
I mean, there's something like throughout my career, the build versus buy decision, right? And I'm sure many of us will recognize this, that when you're quite young in your career or quite junior in your career, you want to build everything. Partly because it's just fun and interesting, right? And partly because you think you can do a better job. Like, how many hack and news comments do we see? Why is this so complicated? I could build that in a weekend. And we're all thinking, oh, no, you couldn't. Or if you did, it would not be fault tolerant, resilient, scalable, right? So I'm just thinking, like, as I've gotten a bit older and wiser, hopefully, I'm happy to pay money for folks to take on responsibility that I either can't do or they can do better, or I don't want to do. And like security is always a good thing here, right? I'm always like, I'm paying money for good quality security products because they just take away risk and hassle. And for me, a lot of times data management is in the same spot there, Natale. That's why I'm like, it's the build versus buy. More often than not, I'm like, hey, I'll pay someone money to kind of take that problem away from me as a developer. I'll focus on what I'm good at, writing the code, connecting the dots. But I kind of want to treat like, the data is somewhat separate, the management of data somewhat separate.
Right. And yeah, that is very interesting topic. But now I would like to bring you back to the developer experience in Kubernetes, which is also a hot topic. So we talked about local cluster. Alex mentioned a kind, the Minikube, where many ways to bring Kubernetes locally. But what do you think about developer? Do you think that developer will be more and more interested of having cloud access, just cloud access, Kubernetes cloud access rather than their local cluster? How do you think developer will develop in the next future? IDE and cloud or mixed thing?
This is a great question. It's almost like tabs versus spaces, or that kind of that vibe, right? Because some people I never give up my IDE. I'm a massive JetBrains fan, right? I'm an IntelliJ user, so love that. But I've also played around with some of the cloud offerings, and they're really good. So my personal thoughts are, give it 5 years, maybe, I'm not exactly sure when, a good chunk of folks will be using online. It's that whole dumb terminal that we used to have back in the day, right? I think it's going that way because it makes sense, right? I can rock up with my iPad, start coding. I can code on my laptop. It's a seamless experience. I can switch between devices as well if I'm coding in the cloud, and I don't have to worry about resources. We're seeing game streaming on TV sort of moving this kind of direction as well, right? You don't need to upgrade your hardware every year because the hardware is being upgraded at kind of the server end, the clever side of the end, and the dumb terminal thing. So I do think it's going to go that way, but it's going to take a long time for everyone to do that, right? 5 years time, it might be fully viable, and a good chunk of the sort of new projects will be fully in the cloud. But I think there's going to be a very long tail here, right? And that's why, shameless plug for the work I'm doing with the team on telepresence. For me, telepresence is that halfway kind of step there, right? You're not cramming everything on your laptop, running everything locally. With telepresence, you can bridge your local dev environment with a remote dev environment. So you're going to get the best of both worlds there. And I think maybe it's a transitioning step to ultimately when we go full cloud. But some folks are like, I just want to run some stuff locally because I trust my setup. I've got all my tools set up locally, but I can't physically run all the stuff on my local machine. I have to use a remote resource. I have to use a remote cluster. And I think there's going to be this, my imagine is that sort of how I imagine the future, there's going to be this sort of step towards fully remote. But I think there's going to be a good chunk of time where we'll need tools like telepresence to bridge that gap.
Right. This is interesting. That brings also into how the Kubernetes cool, developing in Kubernetes cool, so that how we debug also our application. So we have the tool like Jib and Jcube, not to create stuff, but how we debug. You mentioned the telepresence, which is an open source tool to debug Java apps. And also there are also tools like, in general, you can do a port forwarding with the kubectl and connecting to the JDB or any JConsole, anything which expose a port, and you can connect. But tools like telepresence, I think they're really cool because avoid some complexity. And there also, for instance, for Quarkus, there is the Quarkus remote dev mode. So you can connect to the remote application and start debugging the application. This is managed by the framework.
Nice.
I think we have two cool framework. If you like to talk about, Daniel, about telepresence, Anna Marie, if you will talk about Quarkus remote mode, or Alex, we can start about this topic, which is very interesting also for me. I would like to hear from you.
Who's going first? Shall I go first with telepresence?
Yeah.
You go first.
Yeah. So telepresence was created by Ambassador Labs, company I work for, but now, to your point, Natale, it is open source. It is a CNCF sandbox project, so we love contributions. Like, totally folks should pop along to telepresence.io and give us feedback. But the model with telepresence is it's a network, local to remote networking bridge. Yeah. So you run telepresence connect. Then the network namespace in your Kubernetes cluster is available locally. So you can curl service.namespace. Does that make sense? So, like before you do kubectl, port forward, service, etc., and you do need to do a port forward for every service you wanted to access in the remote cluster. Well, telepresence is a complete bridge in that you don't need to do that. You can literally curl all the different services once you've got it set up, as if you were in the cluster. That's the kind of joke I like to make. It's like putting your laptop in the cluster, and then you can access volumes as well. You can, curl services as if they were locally running. The real cool power in telepresence, though, is you could do what's called intercepts, which is rerouting traffic. So we can run a bunch of our stuff remotely. I can set up an intercept for a service. So I can make a request as a user would do against, say, an ingress running in my remote cluster. So I hit my URL, right? And then that traffic can be selectively rerouted to my local machine. So we can use some headers. Yeah, telepresence runs as a sidecar next to your pod in Kubernetes, and it will selectively reroute traffic. So I can run like most of my services remotely, but I can run most of my services remotely, but I can run one locally, say in IntelliJ with debug mode, and I can test everything, by the main website effectively, if I'm using a web app, debug locally, access all my resources in the cluster, and then send the traffic back. So the user can, user or I, if I'm testing, can get the full experience of what the actual application is running like, but I can still debug traffic locally, which is kind of nice. The alternate here, some folks talking about, which I think is an interesting one, is using tools like Scaffold as well. So Scaffold is more about file syncing. So telepresence is very network centric. We're rerouting traffic, we're mapping namespaces, whereas things like Scaffold automate the building of containers in the background. So you actually get sort of higher fidelity testing with that, because you're coding locally, it's building and pushing behind the scenes, and you can test your remote cluster, but you don't get the super fast feedback loop. The thing I really love about telepresence is you get effectively hot reload. Do you know what I mean? If you're like coding, changing locally, you can make requests remotely, and the intercepts routing to your local machine happen in real time. So I get that super fast feedback. But it's always nice to know your options, right? You get the Scaffold approach, a file sync, telepresence approach with network syncing.
That's super interesting. I have some question for this part. Before that, I would like to mention there's someone in the chat. There's Arke Andoro that said that he really hope we don't go back to the age of frame again. So he's a little bit afraid that we're moving too fast into cloud things and not very happy.
Okay, mainframe, Natale.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, no. Just a comment, probably, developer, as you mentioned, like to have their IDE locally, their stuff locally, just because it's the natural way to do it. But I agree with you that the more and more we go forward, the more and more it will be natural to go into browser-based or SaaS service that will speed up the development. And this brings also the other question I have for telepresence. It works, as you said, at the networking level. But how it works with a restricted cluster? If it is needed any special permission, or as a Kubernetes user with my namespace, I can start using a sandbox. The telepresence.
I'm with you. I can sense the security person in you screaming, right? I sometimes do these talks to more operations
I
like
already
folks, like
seen some security folks say, "Hey, what about this?"
100%, right? It's really funny when I do the demo to developers. They're always like, "Whoa, this is amazing! I can map like my namespace locally to remote. Whoa!" But there's always that one security person that's like, "Hang on, how do I stop this?" And if I do the talk to operational folks, straight away it's like, "How do we stop this?" Right? And I'm like, we kind of use kubectl to bootstrap effectively. We have changed it slightly now, but you need your RBAC access. So like if you can't access a production cluster with kubectl, like you won't, telepresence does not sneak around that. Does that make sense? So
Okay.
like, you like all the things you know and love as a DevSecOps person or as a security person, telepresence respects. And I also got an interesting question the other day around network policies. How does telepresence interact with network policies? And there's some nuance to that. I can point folks at some web pages we've got. The engineering team at Ambassador Labs are awesome, and they've documented with the community like our learnings around this. But effectively, when you make a request, so say I'm intercepting a service, so I'm getting traffic from that service rerouted to my local machine, I'm debugging, and if I make a request from my local machine into the cluster, it appears to come from the pod that I'm intercepting. If that makes sense. So if I cannot access that from a layer 3, layer 4 perspective of network policy, like we've said, this pod cannot access that resource, I will not be able to access that locally. But if they've got network policies that say I can, happy days. There's a little edge case around here because you don't have to intercept a service. You can just straight connect into your cluster. And there, the request appears to originate from what we call the traffic manager. We actually spin up a deployment in Kubernetes when you do telepresence connect. And you would need to assign special network permissions to that deployment to say that deployment can talk to all these services or none of the services, or one service or one namespace, that kind of thing. So all the things you know and love about Kubernetes in terms of security, telepresence respects. It's a lesson we've definitely learned at Ambassador Labs, both with telepresence and emissary ingress. If we, kind of comes back to our standardization conversation earlier, if we follow the standards and follow the principle of least surprise, right? We do what Kubernetes constructs should do. So services, route accordingly. We respect network and policies. It just makes everyone's life easier when they come to integrate all the tools. Do you know what I mean? If we did like some sneaky, like, around the sides, get around network policies, like it's going to quite rightly worry security folks, right? Because they're going to be like, well, how do I stop that? So we don't, principle of least surprise. We respect the kind of Kubernetes resource model. We respect the Kubernetes, like almost guarantees of interaction between pods and things like that.
Perfect. That's totally very clear. Thanks for the answer, helping also understand how it works and anticipate the next question from the security folks or network folks. This is very interesting. And I don't know, Ana Maria and Alex, if you like to also talk about this remote dev, the debugging mode of Quarkus, because I think it's important. The more and more we go in cloud SASE, or cloud Kubernetes, the more and more we want to debug our apps live to understand how it works. So telepresence it's a great tool for that. And there is also Quarkus offering something similar. So I would like to know more about it, so we can also discuss about it. If you would like to talk about the remote dev mode of Quarkus,
I can talk about it, but I would like to leave Alex to speak as well if he wants, or I can just bumble about it.
Yeah, any of you. Let's have this open conversation. I'm doing all the difficult question to Daniel. Now some difficult question also to you.
I would like to say, like maybe two things. Okay, the first one is about this: if we are really going to the age of mainframes again. I would say, and yeah, just take this, in the context of what we are discussing. It will be like, do you remember? I mean, that well, yeah, I'm old enough to remember Corva or RMI. Okay,
oh yes.
Think that. Yeah, or even AGB that we mentioned it before with the remote AGBs, because I think that somehow we were doing services architecture that nowadays are really cool, right? We are talking about microservices. Okay, we are using event-driven architectures for implementing them, or RESTful web services. Okay, that's fine. But at the very end, it's just distributed computing. It's exactly the same, let's say, principle of RMI, if you will. Okay, that we are just doing distributed computing, but in a totally different way. I mean, that we know that we are distributing the workloads in checking the boundary context of the use cases and so on. And I think that we are moving to the same thing. I mean that we are just moving to the cloud centric, but it's not going to be the same, because we are just, the principle is the same thing, but with the new technologies and new ways of doing things. This is one thing. Well, this is what I think. And also I'm thinking that for the consultancy world, it's going to be amazing, this approach, because you can work in a project with Java 11, another project with Java 17, and you do not need to install it on your machine. You can have it on remote. So you have exactly the same environment as in production, and you can switch from one environment to another without having to configure anything in your laptop. So I think it's not, I mean, as usual, it has some drawbacks, of course, but it works pretty well. And regarding the Quarkus, yeah, Quarkus, it has one thing that's called live reload or dead mode that allows you to, let's say that you make a change and automatically Quarkus sends this change to the running service and just update it on like a hard reload. Okay, even you can use the Java instrumentation for updating the application. So it's not just a reload of the whole application. You can always or you can even just update one of the parts of the application. Okay, and this is how it works. Basically, you just configure. I mean that you need to configure a login and password when you want to do it remotely, not locally. And then using HTTPS, then you just have this hot reload again. But I would say that it's okay. It depends. If your plan is to have a microservice architecture with Java, but also Go, Python, and so on, then probably telepresence is a better choice, because you only learn one tool. You learn one tool and use it with all the languages. If you are only going to use Quarkus, then okay, then maybe you can use telepresence, or you can use the Quarkus.
I think that's a really interesting point, Alex. I'm like chatting to some folks around using Scaffold, and Scaffold supports exploded wars, and you could do hot reload of class files. So you're not shipping the whole Docker image every time from your local machine. You're shipping just class files, right? And that was fantastic for that team that just used Spring. Right? They were using Spring, Scaffold, hot reload. But as soon as they brought in some like Go or Python, like machine learning stuff, they were like, hey, that workflow doesn't work anymore. Yeah, and I was like, and exactly to your point, I was like, shameless plug, right? Because I was using telepresence, but it was like, hey, it's like the Terraform kind of approach. I always love the HashiCorp, the philosophy of HashiCorp, right? In particular, it's like standardize the workflow. So I may say, if you look at a lot of HashiCorp tools, they've really invested in that. And I think it's the same like with things like telepresence, in that you just learn one workflow that can be repeated across multiple different languages in this case, right? Much like Terraform can be used across multiple clouds, the workflow is consistent. And as a developer, I always think about cognitive load. Do you know what I mean? Like the more tools I have to load into my mind, the slower I'm going to get. And there's just like a limit of how much stuff I can actually have in my brain at one point, right? So I'm definitely a fan. I actually think this is a key discussion going forward. We talk a lot in Bass Labs about a developer control plane. And what that comes down to is like a standardized series of tools that work together that deliver all the functionality you need as a developer. And that's critical to developer experience, right? Because if I'm having to constantly plug in new tools or swap out tools or change my workflow, depending whether it's Spring Boot versus Micronaut or Go, like the cognitive load just goes through the roof. Do you know what I mean? It's like all you want to do is ship code. You sort of, send it out and whatever, and you're suddenly having to like, which tool do I use today? That kind of thing is super complicated, right? So I'm a big fan of like standardizing on tools if you can.
Yeah.
And there's also around standardizing with the tools. As a developer, I've always wanted to, just use a set of tools that work for others. And well, it doesn't bother me. Like if I'm switching the programming language, then I need to learn something else. And back in the day when I was looking for ways to debug, I was actually looking and comparing telepresence. There was also Squash,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Squash.io.
Mm-mm.
And I saw that Squash is missing a few points on that one. And then I was like, oh yeah, telepresence.
Yeah, I think Squash. So I followed the project closely. I don't think it's been maintained in the last few years.
Yes, it was not maintained. That's
Yeah,
another.
it was an interesting approach, Anna, wasn't it, Anna Maria? So they were
It was.
using network proxies, Envoy proxy. If everyone knows and loves Envoy in the cloud, right? Envoy is a fantastic bit of technology. We were at the time with telepresence, we were swapping out deployments. Yeah, and we've actually gone more towards a kind of network model now by using sidecars. We actually use an Envoy to do the intercepts that I talked about as well. So it's interesting to see like technologies kind of come up, they innovate, some succeed, some don't, some get the investment, some don't. Because someone asked me just the other day about what do you think about Squash, and I was like, oh, it's interesting, let's look at the project. And I realized then it hadn't been maintained for a couple of years. And in Kubernetes land, 2 years is like a lifetime, right? I was like, it's probably not going to work now with the current version of Kubernetes.
Well, I think that looking at the tools, if you go to CNCF and you look into the tools, like their maturity level, if there are just some that are not, getting into the hype or are not maintained or have active community around it, people are like, restraining from using that. And I totally get the feeling. I'm worried. Who's going to be there to help me if I have a problem? I might raise a pull request, but who's answering
100%.
to that? But yeah, it's. I think that for the moment, telepresence solves a lot of the problems when it comes to remote debugging. Frameworks also help. By the way, for the Quarkus, just out of my memory, for the developers that love Quarkus and like to work with Quarkus, the remote dev way is like very similar to the MVN Quarkus dev. It's just MVM Quarkus remote minus dev. So it's just adding remote in front of it. And yeah, you just have to customize a bit, but you kind of get access remotely and you can do swaps, and it's really, really cool. Another thing to be mentioned when it comes to, well, because we're talking about DevOps, and I would like to just move things also a little bit into the DevOps world. What do you think helps the DevOps engineers nowadays to speed up their work in terms of tooling for, I don't know, replicating different configurations at a large scale, for example, or any tools that you would recommend?
Oh, great question, Maria. It depends on how sort of opsy that person is. Like for me, DevOps is quite a wide spectrum. Do you know what I mean? Like I definitely consider myself DevOps when I knew a bit of Puppet and a bit of Chef. I was like, I'm DevOps, right? That's going straight on my resume, right? Kind of thing. Then I realized actually like it is, turtles all the way down, right? There's so many layers there. There's like, do you know how the different clouds work and things like that? So my go-to references, I think, if folks are looking to configure cloud resources, I do love Terraform, as I mentioned already from HashiCorp, right? I just love the philosophy of like the HashiCorp team. Terraform for me is great for spinning up infrastructure, these kind of things. So I think that'd be one of my go-to tools. And then it really does depend on what you're working on, I think, right? Because there's many tools, like some super useful, like sort of Kubernetes debugging tools out there. There's super useful cloud debugging tools out there. There's lots of like innovation going on around security in this space at the moment. Like I know the Aqua folks and the Sneak folks have got really interesting scanning tools, these kind of things, right? So it does depend on, DevOps is such a wide variety of roles, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, I was asking more from the because this was a question that was back in the day, very often encountered among the DevOps colleagues coming from the scripting world and from the infrastructure world, where you control everything and you think of everything. So when you have to think of everything, what do you think of, and what is helping you to speed up your work? Because similar to developer world, where you have all these tools to help you to speed up your work, definitely the DevOps side is there, because I hope that people do not work with Kubernetes the hard way.
Yes.
And do the installation by themselves. But that's an option as well. Depends how much you love that. Even in that case, I think you can automatize a little bit I don't imagine that somebody is doing that all the time.
I think it's a really good, if you are like, if anyone's watching the stream and like managing their own Kubernetes, I'd say you've got to have a really good reason to do that. Do you know what I mean? Because there are reasons out there for sure, but but as in, like, I think like using like a distro, a well-known distro, or a managed service totally makes sense, right?
Oh yeah, but also total respect if they can manage all that and all the updates, because I think that updates are the most complicated things.
Oh, 100%.
If you're doing it the hard way, because the other way, it's easy way.
Yeah, and some folks, like to your point, have got to run, like, you know, they've got special circumstances or governance requirements. And yeah, I'm totally with you on that, Anne-Marie. Like the upgrades, like particularly if you're layering on things like Istio and other things, right?
Yeah.
Like I've had lots of folks chat, like, you know, Kubernetes is really hard to upgrade. Then I'm upgrading Istio, then I'm upgrading like some dependencies in my application, and again, it's turtles all the way down, right?
Yeah, it makes some prayers.
Indeed, yes. And that's not a good DevOps philosophy, is it?
Well, yes, you make some prayers. I think it's all would be taking into account also the space of maneuver you have when it comes to upgrading in this kind of situations, because you have to do a lot of backups. You have to be like very well prepared. I mean, it takes in small group to do that, from my point of view.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I've definitely, like, we work with some amazing platform teams in Ambassador Labs, and a tool that does pop up quite a bit is Valero for backing up Kubernetes clusters. See that quite a lot. And a lot of folks, you know, the GitOps principle is very sound these days, right? GitOps all the levels. So a lot of folks, if they are running their own Kubernetes clusters, do use things like Terraform to manage them. So goes straight into version control, and then your Kubernetes config, you're probably using Helm, right? So all those charts or the reference to the charts, Helm files, go into your repo as well. So it should be kind of like, to use that old phrase, like turnkey. Like if for some reason your complete infrastructure disappeared, you should be able to go, right, yeah, here's how I do my base level infrastructure, here's how I do my Kubernetes, here's how I do my Istio, here's how I do my applications. I've seen the Weaveworks team talk a lot about this, because obviously they're the originators of GitOps, right? They're awesome people. But I remember Alexis did a blog a few years ago about how like they destroyed their production infrastructure, and he wasn't worried. It's like, crank the handle, redeploy it all, because it's all in version control, right? And like, how cool is that?
Well, that's the right way to do it. I mean, it gives you a little bit of peace to your mind, thinking that, well, it's okay. It's in Git. It's there, and you didn't lose anything. 100%. It's way better than the other ways, I think. You sleep at night, unless you want some adrenaline from time to time, and
Yeah, that's interesting, and because it also introduced a topic about how to connect the inner loop to the outer loop, to developer inner loop, the developer outer loop. So we discussed about it today. No, now probably the developer inner loop can also be on cloud, on Kubernetes directly. Historically, was just in the workstation. Now it could be in Kubernetes. And then it started the outer loop, which is still in Kubernetes. And Daniel, you mentioned tooling like can be pipeline or Argo CD for GitOps or any other GitOps tool. So it's all connected. It's all automated. It's very cool. You can basically plug in a dependency framework, a stack project, and build your own stack and build this automation. I think it's really cool. What do you think about having this power as a developer? Just push and starting everything up to prod in so many loops.
Yeah, I love it. But with great power comes great responsibility, right? We're all thinking that, right? So, but yeah, and a shameless plug, actually, I'm doing a workshop in a couple of weeks' time. Pop along to Dev House on Ambassador Labs. We're talking about Argo CD and Argo rollout. So I'll actually walk folks through, myself and Edidion, my colleague, will walk folks through setting up like a sort of basic pipeline. And it is magic when you see it, right? When you get like, cause if all you've been doing is kubectl, and suddenly you realize that, you know, that's like SSHing into prod, right? You shouldn't really be doing kubectl on your production clusters. But when you spin up Argo, you get like this fantastic UI, the Argo CD, that gives you insight into how your applications are running within your cluster. then you can very easily say, oh, I commit some stuff to Git, and Argo magically syncs and makes it all happen, and suddenly, boom, your target cluster is in sync with your state in Git. And I was like, this is amazing. Then layer on Argo rollouts to do canary releasing is even more magical. You can link it up with, say, something like Prometheus or Datadog, or pick your monitoring provider, and you can say, I want to release this new service to 20% of traffic, run these tests. If the metrics look good, do 40% of traffic. If the metrics look good, do 60%, these kind of things. And usually by the end of the workshop, people are like, their minds are blown, right? They're like, hang on, I've literally gone from like, just specifying in a Git repo my target state declaratively, like, new version of the app, V3 of my app, for example, and they've got this, all of it automated from rollout to canary release. Yeah, and that's where, it's not that Argo and I love Argo CD and rollouts, but there's Flux and Flagger. There's other tools in this space too. But I really enjoy teaching people how to use Argo CD and rollouts, because the light bulb just goes on at the end, right?
That's very cool. To be honest, it's something very, very cool that we see. There's great momentum also in the community about Argo CD and GitOps. We have a question in the chat that it comes from Twitch. So what do you recommend for monitoring the compliance of network configuration of Kubernetes cluster when using encrypted VPN tunnels? So Daniel, that looks not trivial question. Is there anything we can recommend for network configuration in Kubernetes for encrypted VPN tunnels?
Yes, so that is pretty close to the edge of my comfort boundary, I'll be honest. The things that pop up, like HIDS systems, host intrusion detection systems, like a lot of the commercial ones, I'm not going to drop any names because it wouldn't be fair. Have a Google around for HIDS, or host intrusion detection. They do a lot of this stuff. Like there's Kubernetes specific versions of these. I've got to shout out to the Sysdig folks as well. So the Sysdig folks do amazing work for detecting changes on machines, and they're using like eBPF, and again, edge of my comfort level here, but I've seen Dan Pop, who's awesome on Twitter. You definitely want to follow Dan Pop. I've seen him talk a lot about using Sysdig to detect nefarious actions if people are breaking in and doing things like that. So that would be my go-to. It's a very specialist domain, and it's a super important domain as well, and it's one where I often would defer to like experts in that field. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's
great question.
That's a great question, and that's great answer also. So thanks for this for answering this question. It's interesting, and also we have in the chat someone talking about Argo CD is a CNCF matured project. Well, Argo CD is having a very great momentum. It's basically the extended CD or powerful CD. I don't know. Probably one of the best features is that can be multi-cluster.
Yes, yeah.
And do you have any thoughts about Argo CD? Any cool stuff developer can achieve with Argo CD?
I'm a huge fan. I actually did a shameless plug again. I did a podcast with Alex M, who works at Intuit, because the main folks behind Argo CD, I would say, would be Intuit, BlackRock, and yourselves, Red Hat, right? Big sponsors. Right. And Alex M talked a lot about the sort of origins of Argo CD, Argo rollouts, and the benefits and things. So like point folks to InfoQ for that podcast. But for me, like the thing that Alex really switched me on to was the value of the UI. Simple. A lot of us talk about the GitOps model, right? And the GitOps is super powerful. Don't get me wrong. As a developer, you define, your declared state in Git, and magically Argo CD makes it happen in your target cluster. But Alex walked me through it. Like a lot of engineers would often be like, "What's the state of my deployment? Why is this failed?" And sure, you can go splunking in kubectl logs and all this kind of stuff, right? But that's pretty gnarly. And what Alex was saying is they've invested, the community the Argo community is investing a lot in developer experience, user experience, right? Making it super easy to go, hey, here's how my deployment's running. And when you're doing canarying, you often have like duplicate pods running, right? Because your new version of your application is running alongside of your old version. And you can very quickly see that. compared to, kubectl get services, not quite so easy to understand. I'm a big terminal person, love my terminal, right? But there's a time and a place for a really good UI. So for me, I'm a massive fan of the UI work going on within the Argo projects. And we've only mentioned Argo CD and rollouts. There's many other Argo projects going on as well, the events, the workflows. Like for me, it's turning into a very powerful set of tools that is going to give you like the complete end-to-end of I've got my code, how do I get it into production, and with a bunch of other functionality like the events, for example, is even more opportunity there, I think. So as a developer, check out the Argo project. I like it. It's not in fact, it is as many contributors here, like your voice will be counted, I think is great, right? I think sometimes when some of the bigger projects, they're stewarded by just one or two, say, companies, it's a little bit harder to get your voice heard in these things. But I think Argo, the community is very welcoming, which is really good.
That's very active community. There's gonna be GitOps Con before KubeCon as a 0-day event. There are lots of convo right now for
there are a lot on that.
Lots of stuff. There's also ArgoCon happening, if I recall correctly. So definitely check out those cons because they're really, really cool. And the community Argo is also active on the Slack channel. I think it's the Cloud Native Computing Foundation Slack channel.
Yep.
There's the working group GitOps. So I really I recommend you to join the working group. They have a meeting where they talk about GitOps and implementation of Kubernetes. Very, very cool. I think it's a nice one. I will send in the chat the link to the RTD project for those of you that are not aware of or just want to read more about Argo CD. So you know what, we're at the end of the show. We didn't follow the structure that Sebi was doing, like live demos at the end, but because we have lots of cool stuff to talk about with Daniel today. So thanks very much, Daniel, for this interview. We touched many points: Kubernetes, local development, cloud development, debugging application, tooling, how to debug live application, deploying application, GitOps, mainframe at some point, and VPN and firewall.
We did well, yeah. Great questions to the community as well. So awesome.
I'm really happy about this. So we have a couple minutes left. If you want to say something to the community, I will in the while leave in the chat all the links. I will share in the chat Daniel's Twitter, if you like to.
Twitter is always the best way. Like, I'm always happy to chat to folks. You can find me. I'm Daniel Bryant UK on most of the interwebs, like GitHub, LinkedIn, Twitter. I'm speaking actually at DevX Days, which is a colo with KubeCon. So I'm talking about developer experience. I'm talking about all the things we've been talking about today. Actually, I'm talking about my experience with Cloud Foundry, how it maps to Kubernetes, and the lessons I've learned of building platforms. So that could be a really interesting thing for folks to check out. There's so much going on around KubeCon, right? We're running a DevHouse, our little meetup, online virtual meetups. I'd love to see folks at DevHouse. Pop in, pop out. We're running some Zooms, running some chats, and basically just like reach out to me. I love like chatting to folks. I love learning. I love answering questions. So please do get in contact with me.
Fantastic. Thanks, Daniel. That was really, we were really glad to have you today as our super guest. I know Alex know already, you know already all the developer advocate Java champions here in Red Hat. Very happy to have you here today. Thanks, Anna Maria. Thanks, Alex, for joining me in this choral, let's say, show. The show will come back in 2 weeks. So not the next Tuesday, the other Tuesday. And with Sebi and another interview planned for the cloud native topics. And if you are attending OpenShift TV, the schedule will come back tomorrow. If you are in EMEA time zone, we will come back on Wednesday with the OpenShift TV coffee break. Thank you, everyone, joining. Any final words, Alex, Anna Maria?
Well, I can say one more thing to what you added regarding Daniel. I recommend also his books. I have one in hard copy.
Shameless plug.
I want it. Please send me.
That's the one I have.
Continuous delivery in Java. Thank you.
Yeah, so I recommend that one. It was really helpful to read it. So Yeah. And actually, I love everything that you're writing, because I'm following you on Twitter, and thanks to that, I can get a follow of what you're writing in other places as well. So yes, definitely follow Daniel if you are interested to connect the developer world to the DevOps world. I think I'm one of the best people to follow.
Thank
That's
you,
it.
very kind. Thank you.
For me, it has been really a pleasure to see you again, because it was a long time, this pandemic, and hope to see you in 1 month in DevOps UK.
Oh yeah.
Because I'm in theory, yeah, I will be there.
Interesting. Yes, I've been hearing some interesting chat around that.
Yeah, so hope you can see that.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
See you in the next show, or happening on Tuesday, the 14th. See you at KubeCon if you will attend KubeCon. It's going to be local and virtual, so everyone can attend. Thank you, Daniel, and see you next time. Ciao.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Natale. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.